You're going to get a lot of imagery here, okay, in verse, through verse 13, a lot of imagery. The dead tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Sheol is naked before God, and Abaddon has no covering. He stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the waters with the clouds, and the cloud is not split open under them. He covers the face of the full moon and spreads over it his cloud. He has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his wind the heavens were made fair, and his hand pierced the fleeing serpent. So you see a lot of imagery there, right? And that imagery, like some of it, when I first read through it, I had to sit down and really think about it. So like he has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. What's he talking about there? The reflection of the moon on the water on the horizon. So if you read it again, then it makes sense, right? Like I had to think about it and read it again. He inscribed a circle on the face of the waters, right? At the boundary between light and darkness, right? Like where the horizon meets, if there's that sunset or sunrise or moon, right? There's the circle that reflects off of it. But he's kind of giving this image, first of all, of God's greatness over all creation, right? Like everything. He says, the dead tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Sheol is naked before God. Abaddon has no covering. So he has power over death and hell. What's interesting, and normally when I talk about hell with people, some people are like, well, what's the experience of it, and what kind of suffering? But one of the things that we're reminded of in hell is that, we get this imagery, I think, from movies in Hollywood, that Satan is the king of hell, like Satan rules over hell, like God rules over heaven, Satan rules over hell. Satan does not rule over hell. Satan suffers in hell. Satan is bound there. And in fact, the whole reason Satan wants God's people to go to hell is because, A, he wants them to suffer just like he is, and B, anything that God loves, Satan wants to destroy. Right? So he's saying here, look, God is the one who rules over hell. Nobody else does. God has all authority and all power, even over the dead, over those who are buried in the waters, those who are in Sheol and Abaddon. Like, it's naked before God. God sees it all.
What's Abaddon?
So both of those have to do with views of hell in some way. So like Sheol, in some respects, can be either talking about hell, or there was also at that time, outside of many of the gates, it's very different than like in our cities now. You could almost think garbage hill, okay? So Menominee Falls, garbage hill. But what they would take is they would take everything and they would burn it. It would be a never-ending burning pile of garbage and discarded dead bodies. Yeah. So, and the smell is probably just as bad, if not worse, than on certain days, right? And so they would have that. So they're kind of talking about that kind of imagery. And so Sheol, Abaddon, there's other pictures for that in the scriptures. But in this setting, so context matters, right? So in this setting, he's talking about death and hell and the deep. And the deep was, so at that time in the deep, or the waters, was considered a more chaotic, deadly thing. Because like people didn't have YMCAs and park districts where they learned to swim back then. Right? And they didn't have the technology to go on boats like they did. So even expert fishermen, like the disciples, would have been afraid of water in the large storms, right? Because they don't have any way of dealing with that. In fact, kind of another interesting aside. So do you remember where Peter says in the gates of hell, or Peter confesses Jesus, and Jesus says to Peter, Peter, on this your confession, I will build my church. You're the rock, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades will have no power over it. And he confesses that at a place called Caesarea Philippi. If you ever go to Caesarea Philippi, there used to be a huge temple there, an ungodly temple. to Pan and some other pagan gods. And what they used to do is offer child sacrifices there. And there was a huge mouth to a cave there that had a river running into it way down where you couldn't see what was going. And they called that the gates of Hades. So they would cast these dead bodies onto the gates of Hades, and they felt that that sacrifice would be carried off to appease the gods. That's watery, right? Like a watery grave, like those kind of things. So that Abaddon is referencing some of that. He stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. So he's talking about how the earth is a blip. He says that there's so much nothingness out there we don't even know. He binds up the clouds. The cloud is not split under them. He's talking about the heaviness of the waters, right? Like the waters are heavy, but it doesn't destroy the clouds or split them. They can actually hold it. And in some ways, Job is saying, I don't even know how that works. Like we have science that tells us this stuff, right? And at that time, if you think about it, how did they try to figure out how nature worked? They created gods. Right? Apollo. How does the sun work? Well, we got Apollo. Apollo makes the sun work. Right? Like, so they would do things. So Baal and Ashtaroth, they felt how fertility worked, how crops were grown. And so they tried to explain everything through the gods. Job here just goes, look, I don't know how the rain works. I know it does. I know God makes it work, but I would think that the clouds would split under how heavy the rain is, but somehow, right? And there may even have been a belief at that time, Job not knowing how it worked, that there was water above the clouds. How did the clouds hold that water back? Not knowing how it all worked. God knew. They didn't have to, right? So he gives all of this just to say, this is the greatness of God. And this is the power of God. This is how all of nature is under his control. And then it gets to verse 14. It says, behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways. How small a whisper do we hear of him? But the thunder of his power, who can understand? So what's Job saying there in summary? Talk about the greatness of God, the deep of the water, the creatures, the rain.
The whispers compared to the thunder of his power.
Yeah.
The might.
Yeah. So have you ever been in a horrible storm? Just a horrible storm? Yeah. Right? Or ever gone into a basement during tornado warnings and heard how horrible that wind is whipping around? Job is saying that is a whisper of his power. Right? And I've never been a part of this, but I can only imagine what it must have been like in Florida during a hurricane like the one that ripped through Fort Myers. This is a whisper of his power. Whew. Yeah. And Job's going to get to this, but when we think about the power of God, there should be some fear attached to that, right? If that's how powerful God is, like, God could just wish us or think us out of existence if he wanted to. Right? Kind of like
part of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
He smashed it back together.
Yeah. And that took no effort, right?
Nothing left.
Like when God created creation and rested on day 7, it wasn't because he was tired.
No.
Right? He didn't need 24 hours to create on each day. He could have created all of day 1 through 6 basically with a thought. He actually did it for us, for our rhythm. When you think about it, I mean, he gave the rhythm of what was the very first thing Adam and Eve ever did? Nothing. Right? They were created on day 6. What did they do on day 7? Rested. Walked in the garden. They did nothing. They got to be lazy on that first day. But it's a reminder to us, God didn't create us so that we could work super hard to take a day off. He gave rest first, not last. It's a gift. So yeah, this is just a whisper of his power, the outskirts of his ways. It's kind of like, I always say, view it this way, so with David, my son, whenever he wants to wrestle me, Like, I know what could literally happen if I wanted it to. Right? Like, it could be over real fast, real painfully, and for good. Like, he will never ask to wrestle me again. But I don't do that. Right? I restrain that power. I restrain what I know and what I'm capable of doing. I restrain all the experience I had wrestling since I was like 6 years old. Right? I restrain that. So he gets an outskirt of what I know, an outskirt of what I could do, but he doesn't get the fullness of it. It's the exact same thing that he's going at, and in a much bigger way. You don't even understand how powerful God is. I mean, that's why I think Jesus coming into this world and dying on the cross, the greatest act of grace in Genesis chapter 2 is God didn't just hit the reset button. You go, yeah, Adam and Eve messed it up, let's just scrap it and start over again. You know, like a bad painting. He had the grace to go, you know what? I got this, and I'll send my son, and even though he can do whatever he wanted to, as all the power of the universe, we'll let him die on the cross and restrain that power. That's Job. That's Job's response. Guys, you don't even get it. Now Job continues. Now he's going to talk about his response to this amazing power that we only get a glimpse of, a whisper of. Right? So Job again took up his discourse and said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter." What's he talking about there?
All the stuff taken away from us.
Yeah, so everything bad that happened, right? Like all the brokenness, the pain, the loss. It says, God took away my right, He made my soul bitter. As long as my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. So what's his response to his friends?
Not gonna say anything.
Yeah, I'm not gonna say anything about God. You know, some of that might be a little bit of this like awe and fear of God. I know what he could do. So I'm not going to say nothing bad about him.
Could get worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Says, I'm not going to utter any falsehood. I'm not going to utter any deceit. As long as there is breath inside of me. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. As I was reading, I was thinking, would that be me? How hard must that have been for Job to restrain from lashing out at God bitterly? Right? How easy is it for us? God, why would you do this to me? God, what is wrong with you? Do you even know what's going on? Do you even see what's going on in my life? God, what is wrong with you? Right? Like, I wonder how many of us would have had that response right away to all that loss.
It would be easy to go that route,
Yeah.
but
What would he gain?
you have to.
Yeah. But I think there are a lot of people, I mean, a lot of people in today's world, that's the route they take, isn't it?
Yeah.
And even we do that sometimes. Something bad happens, and we just kind of, why? And I'm not saying asking why is bad, but asking why with the tone of questioning God. That's different than going, God, I don't understand, versus God, I'm questioning your judgment. Right? Those are two different things. God, I understand, could you help me understand? Like, I want to trust you in this moment. I believe in you. I don't get it. Versus, like, God, what is wrong with you? Is it getting cold in here now?
Yes. Very.
Very?
Very.
All right, maybe it's switched the other way. This is like the thermostat we're going to argue about, so at home. So, all right, so I did turn it off, so hopefully it'll dissipate a little bit. So that's where he starts his discourse. He goes on, let my enemy be as the wicked, Let him who rises up against me as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off, when God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call upon God at all times? And will teach you concerning the hand of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Behold, all of you have seen it yourselves. Why then have you become altogether vain? So what's Job's prayer in this moment? What is he saying?
He's hoping the punishment that he had would go to his enemy.
Yeah. And that's a very psalm-like thing, right? We have something called the imprecatory psalms, where there is that God bring vengeance upon your enemy, or my enemy, which God, if I'm on your side, is your enemy, right? And so he's like saying that, and at the same time, he's asking his friends, who is the real enemy in this situation? Yeah. But if we blame God, then we make God out to be the enemy. Like, if God did this to me, then he's my enemy. Versus, this is the working of sin and brokenness caused by Satan and our own sinfulness that's in the world. Like, God's not the enemy. When bad things happen, we go to the doctor and get a diagnosis that we don't want. When we're told about something terminal in our life or somebody else's life that we love, God's not the enemy in that moment. And many times we can make God that enemy because, God, you have power over all creation. That's true. One of the things that I think beautiful about the book of Job is this. When suffering, pain, and brokenness come into Job's life, what was God's role and what was Satan's role?
Satan wanted him to have, wanted God to take it all away.
Yeah. And what was God's response? Remember?
He did.
He let it.
He did. But he knew that Job would be faithful.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that there is this struggle that we need to have with God does have all the power in the universe to stop, thwart, or to protect us from anything that could happen. He could. If God had said no to Satan, could Satan have done it? No. So I think there is that struggle we have to say, because if we believe God has power over all things, nothing happens without the power of God. Nothing happens without God's knowledge of it, and his hand is in all things, then when difficulties come, we can't say, well, God is removed from that. God is not removed from the suffering of Job. Suffering happens because of sin. Suffering happens because of that effect of the brokenness of sin in the world, right? And I've shared this before. There's a difference between sin and the effect of sin. Right? A hurricane is not sin. A hurricane is the effect of sin. Cancer is not sin. Cancer is the effect of sin. A miscarriage is not sin. A miscarriage is the effect of sin. Right? So there's a difference. But even the effects of sin, God is there in the midst of it. I think there's a struggle with that because sometimes we'll say things like, well, God removed him from that situation. No, God's never removed from any situation. That's a hard thing, I think, to come to terms with. God is there. God could have said no to Satan. And Job didn't have to go through all of this if God said no. And so there is a purpose to suffering. There's a purpose in the plan of God, in the power of God, in all of this. He's there, but he's not the enemy. Right? And Job gets that dynamic. There's a tension between God's the enemy, but God has his hand in things. Right? And so we can't just say, well, it's kind of like, I'll hear this and I get the well-meaning thought of this, but it's not true, where people will say, well, a school shooting happens in a public school, or something terrible happens, people will be like, well, you know, you're moved to prayer from the school, so God's not there, so why would he intervene? No, God is there. Absolutely. Otherwise, if there's a school shooting in a Christian school, is that because God wasn't there? Like, we have a whole other issue with absolutely removing prayer and like that. That's a different conversation. But to use that to say that's why the school shooting happened, and I hear Christians using that, I'm like, please stop. Because that's saying that God removes himself from every situation where his name and his word isn't present. That's not true at all. God is present in all places, at all times, in all things. And the sun and the rain shine and fall on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. Right? So do we want prayer, Ten Commandments, and God's Word in public schools? Absolutely we do. But that's not why bad things happen in public schools. God's removed himself. Absolutely not. All right, so he says God's not the enemy here. He goes on. This is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage that oppressors receive from the Almighty. If his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his descendants have not enough bread. Those who survive him, the pestilence buries, and his widows do not weep. Though he heap up silver like dust, and pile up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the righteous will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth's, like a booth that a watchman makes. He goes to bed rich, but will do so no more. He opens his eyes, and his wealth is gone. Terrors overtake him like a flood, and in the night a whirlwind carries him off. The east wind lifts him up, and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls at him without pity. He flees from its power in headlong flight. It claps its hands at him and hisses at him from its place. Now, a lot of imagery again going on here. There is a misinterpretation of this that goes something like this. Well, God will only bless the righteous, but not the unrighteous. And you can read this passage that way, right? If you wanted to, you could read this passage as saying that the things that God has created are only for the righteous and not for the unrighteous. So you could read, if his children are multiplied, it is for the sword. His descendants do not have enough bread. Those who survive him, pestilence will bury, and his widows don't weep for him. And he will heap up silver, but it'll be like dust, and pile up clothing like clay. He may pile it up, but the righteous will wear it. Meaning, God's going to take everything that the unrighteous get, he's going to take it all away from them and give it to the righteous. And so if you love God enough, if you believe in God enough, you will have a prosperous life. That's not what he's saying here. Okay? So that is a misunderstanding of the text. What is he saying? Well, the key, I think, if you want, or the easiest section to read this, is starting verse 16. Though we heap up silver like dust and pile up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the righteous will wear it, and the innocent will divide his silver. For he builds his house like a moth's, like a booth that a watchman makes. He goes to bed rich, but will do so no more. He opens his eyes, and his wealth is gone. And then he continues talking about terrors that overtake him, worry that is always there, concern for the things that he has. What he's talking about is the value and the worry and concern that comes when you only have a worldly perspective. Hey, he's building up silver like clay. He builds his house like a moth's, a booth that a watchman makes. Meaning, he puts so much value in it, but it's really not valuable at all. It's not worth what he believes that it should be worth in his life. And ultimately, it's pointing to what all of this is on the last day. Like a heavenly kingdom, not an earthly kingdom, right? I mean, none of this stuff you get to take with you. None of this stuff matters at all. I think I've shared this one before, but it's the old joke of the guy who dies, is buried with his gold, goes to heaven, drags along his sack of golden bricks, gets to the pearly gates, St. Peter is there, he goes, what are you trying to bring in with you? He goes, all my stuff. He goes, let me see it. He goes, why did you bring pavement?
Yeah.
Right? Like, It's not worth anything. Your house is like a moth's house. Your silver is like clay. In the kingdom of God, it really has no value at all. Think about the power of God, the majesty of God, everything God has at his disposal. If God wanted to make your gold invaluable, he could snap his fingers and fill the earth with so much gold, its value is nothing. Right? That's what God can do. You're piling all these things up. It's nothing. And then verse 20, this one, at least when I read it, kind of struck. Terrors overtake him like a flood. In the night, a whirlwind carries him off. And if all you're concerned about is the things of this world, then you're going to be terrified if the things of this world are threatened. If your money is threatened, if your house is threatened, if your livelihood is threatened, if your job is threatened, if that's what you live for is the temporal, then you will be constantly overtaken by terrors like a flood. You're like, you know what? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Then terrors don't overtake you. Right? To me, it goes back to when Jesus speaks in Matthew, and he's like, why do you worry? Do you see how I clothe the lilies of the field? They don't worry. They don't stress. God makes them beautiful. See the birds of the air? I don't think they're really anxious about how they're going to eat. They just fly and God provides something. They go, why are you stressing about it? You're made in the image of God. Birds are not. If I'm going to feed them, do you think I'm going to feed you? And so it's this idea that if we're having a very worldly perspective, then the terrors that come from a worldly perspective will overtake us. And he doesn't say this, but I think it even comes down to the possession of the physicalness of our bodies. Like if we understand, if we have an eternal perspective, we're going to understand that our bodies can be torn down like a house that's like a moth's, or silver that's like clay. Our bodies will be torn down over time. And things will not always work the way that they always did. Like, for instance, I'm seeing the chiropractor like every 2 to 3 days right now. I did something in my back. It's not healing like it was when I was 20. Yeah. I could go to bed with a back pain and wake up and be 100% the next morning. Now I'm like, just keep cracking it. Just keep making it straight. Like it's just right. Like that's our bodies. They're going to keep doing that. And there's a pastor, Tim Keller. Tim Keller, he just passed away. He's a great theologian. He said this as he was dying. He goes, "So I'm not afraid of death. For a Christian, the only thing death can do is make me better." Yeah. I'm like, I love that phrase. The only thing death can do is make me better. If that's your perspective, that's what Job is saying, isn't it? Yeah. Like you worry about all this stuff, and you want better stuff. You'll get it someday. It's just not in this world. And then you won't have to be afraid of losing it, because God has all of His power, chapter 26, to do whatever He wants to at His disposal. And then verse 22 and 23. It hurls at him without pity. He flees from its power in headlong flight. It claps its hands at him and hisses at him from its place. You see the mocking? Right? You think you're happy? It's all gone. Isn't this what Job experienced? Yeah. Like this is Job talking about his experience. I had riches, I had wealth, I had houses, I had land, I had animals, I had family. It's all gone. If that was my hope, then, verse 20, terrors would overtake me like a flood. This is Job's experience right here in this chapter. So he explains all of this. And then goes, but where is wisdom? In the midst of suffering, in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of pain, where is wisdom? And this is chapter 28. It says this. Surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold that they refine. Iron is taken out of the earth and copper is smelted from the ore. Man puts an end to darkness and searches out to the farthest limit. The ore in bloom, when and deep darkness. He opens shafts in a valley away from where anyone lives. They are forgotten by travelers. They hang in the air, far away from mankind. They swing to and fro. As for the earth, out of it comes bread, but underneath it is turned up as by fire. Its stones are the place of sapphires, and it has dust of gold. The path no bird of prey knows, and the falcon's eyes has not yet seen. The proud beasts have not trodden it. The lion has not passed over it. Man puts his hand to the flinty rock and overturns mountains by the roots. He cuts out channels in the rocks, and his eyes see every precious thing. He dams up the streams so that they do not trickle. The thing that is hidden he brings out to the light. What is he saying here? He's giving imagery of like metalworking, right? Minerals in the earth. He's talking about where it's found and searching it out.
Man doesn't know where it even is, but God does.
Yeah.
He works with it.
Yeah. Like man has to keep searching for it. And he learns how to utilize it, but it doesn't come from him, does it? He doesn't know where it is. It doesn't come from him. But when he finds it, he refines it and utilizes it and uses it for the good. This is wisdom. And then goes on and says, and animals may have a better sense of where it is, but they have no clue what to do with it.
Yeah.
But man, when he has it and finds it, he can do all sorts of things with it because there's a difference. And what he's going to end up talking about is wisdom. Like, does wisdom have its origin in man or God? God. And I think that's some of the struggle today is, in today's world, is that people try to find wisdom from themselves and their own ideas, their own philosophies, and their own progressiveness of what they think the world should be. And they seek out wisdom. This is actually, if you remember back to our sermon series on Colossians, something called Gnosticism, where they would say, we are trying to search out the secret knowledge of God. And if we want to know the secret knowledge of God, we know where to go. Right? Like there's one place to go. Anything that hasn't been revealed to us, right, like we don't know. Which is why sometimes when people ask questions, and the best answer to give is we don't know because God doesn't say. And that's an okay, good answer. God didn't tell us, so I'm not sure. Like, what's exactly heaven going to be like? Like, we're going to be in God's presence. It's going to be a place without suffering and peace. What's it going to be like? I don't know. What are we going to do all day? I don't know. I don't think we're going to sit on clouds singing Kumbaya, but right, but what exactly is it going to be like? Like, what exactly are we going to be doing? Are we all just going to be staring at Jesus and singing the whole time? I don't know. But we have images of that, but right, like it's okay to say we don't know if Scripture doesn't tell us. Scripture tells us the things we need to know. If we want to know the unsearchableness of God's wisdom, we find the outskirts, chapter 26, right? The outskirts of his knowledge here. The fullness of his knowledge. Really, and I think that takes us right back to that 26 where he says the outskirts of his power, the outskirts of his wisdom, the outskirts of his... One of the things I think we struggle with sometimes is, even Christians, is we say things like God is holy, God is powerful, God is wise, God is loving. And then we try to understand those words, holy, powerful, wise, loving, through our wisdom, our power, or the lens of what it means to be a human. Instead of understanding, sometimes those words go beyond anything we could ever understand. Like we'll get a glimpse of it, and that's what Paul says, like, we see, but in a shadowed way. We see through, I guess you could say, foggy lenses.
Yeah.
Someday it'll be wiped clear. That's what he's saying here. Look, you don't know where wisdom comes from. You're going to get a glimpse of it. You'll be able to use some of it. But the world doesn't. Okay? So he gives that image right there. Continuing in verse 12. But where shall wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me. The sea says, it's not in me. It cannot be bought for gold, and silver cannot be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, or the precious onyx or sapphire. Gold and glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for jewels of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or of crystal. The price of wisdom is above pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. So he's talking about where is wisdom, and then goes on to say what? Yeah. And so what isn't it? It's not something that we can understand. We can't buy it. We can't even on our own search it out. We may.
Nowadays, we do try to measure it, though, don't we?
There is truth to that, right? Right? Like, there's all sorts of things we try to do on our own. He's like, man, it's so much more valuable than all this gold and onyx and sapphire and pearls, which means you can't even buy it. It's not like you have anything to offer God to get wisdom. The only way you can have wisdom is when God gives it to you. And if that's the case, then think about how valuable wisdom is. This goes to Proverbs, right? Proverbs talks about how valuable God's wisdom is. More precious than silver and gold. And then 20 to 28. From where then does wisdom come? Where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living, and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and death. So there's that picture of Abaddon, death, Hades, hell, Sheol. We have heard a rumor of it with our ears. They're like, oh, we don't know. We've heard of it. God understands the way of it. He knows his place. For he looks at the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he gave to the wind its weight, and apportioned the waters by measure. When he made a decree for the rain, and a way for the lightning of the thunder. Then he saw it and declared it. He established it and searched it out. And he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and turning away from evil is understanding. So where is wisdom? Yeah, the fear of the Lord, right? So if you look at, it's interesting, verse 12 and verse 20, you find almost the exact same questions, worded a little bit different, but almost exactly the same. And it denotes the difference of how the world tries to find wisdom and value wisdom and see wisdom in God. Where God says, look, you're trying to find wisdom. Stop looking for where wisdom is found and look where it has come from. Right? And that brings us to two different places. If we're trying to find wisdom, then we're trying to find it around us. If we're trying to seek where it comes from, then we're looking for the source of it. And the source of it brings us to Christ. The source of it brings us to his presence. The source of, I've been saying this, and this came probably from one of my seminary professors, and the whole idea that so often we look for places and things, even Christians, we do this when we talk about things like, where do you go when you die? And the obvious response, most people say, is I go to heaven. Yes. But the Christian response actually would be better saying, is I go to be with Jesus. I remember a preacher once asked this question. If you could go to heaven, perfect heaven, right? Like no more pain, no more suffering, no more sickness, no more cancer, no more brokenness, no more pains and aches, and no more need and want, no more struggles and anxiety, only joy and happiness. But Jesus isn't there. Would you still be happy? Right? And so many people go, yeah, because I got everything perfect. Like, no. Not if you're a Christian who understands the point of what all of this is about, it's not to get to some perfect place of peace and happiness. It's to get to Jesus. This is, I love Thomas in the Scriptures. I think Thomas gets the worst rap of anybody in the Bible. I just do. Doubting Thomas. Because if you look at Thomas, his question before Jesus dies, and then look at why he doubts after he dies, I think it sheds light on why. Anyone know the question that Thomas asks, or his greatest concern before Jesus dies? It's in the book of John. Jesus is talking about going away. The disciples are like, they don't understand this. What are you talking about? He goes, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place, I will come back so that where I am, you may be also. Right? Like Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you. But then he says, where I am, you may be also. Right? Like it's not about the place, it's about coming to me. And Thomas goes, we don't know where you're going. How can we get to you? What was Thomas's greatest concern is he didn't want to be separated from Jesus. He's like, Jesus, tell me how to find you. Like, if you're going away, like, how do we get there? Because I want to be with you. And then when Jesus rises from the dead, and all the rest of them, like, Thomas gets a bad rap, but if you read the post-resurrection account, all the disciples doubted. It wasn't just Thomas. Thomas is the one called Doubting Thomas. It should have been called Doubting Disciples. They all doubted. Thomas is just like, I think, the way I read it, is I think Thomas is saying, don't get my hopes up that he's alive and back. If he's not really back, don't play a trick on me. I need to see it. That's why I don't believe it, because I want to be where Jesus is, and if he's not really back, then I don't know how to get to where Jesus is. Like, that's the whole point, right? He's saying, you want to know where it's found, I'll show you who it comes from. And that's more important. Because even if you don't have full wisdom and understanding, you don't need it if you're next to the one who does. Okay? So, like, my daughter, she had to do taxes this year. She has no clue what to do when she's doing her taxes. None. So guess where she sat in order to have her taxes done? Right next to me, because I know how to do her taxes. I don't know how to do mine. Mine are very much more complex as a pastor. But for her, I can do that. So she didn't have to have the wisdom to do taxes as long as she sat next to somebody who did. That's what he's saying, is you don't have to have the wisdom of the universe as long as you're standing next to the one who does. And then I'll take care of it. You can rest in me. He says, I'm the one where wisdom is found. And then at the end, yeah, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And turning away from evil, that's understanding it. But the fear of the Lord is wisdom. And I think, in a way, that takes us all the way back to chapter 26. Because what did he describe again in chapter 26? First part of what we went through today.
They were trying to help them, but they really had no idea how to help them.
Yeah, because of how powerful God is, right? Like, you don't even get it. Like, that's the outskirts of his power. That's the outskirts of his strength. Like, we barely even understand how mighty he is. And if we had that, we would have a greater fear of God. In an awe-struck, worship-filled way, and there's a way in which there should be an awestruck, I'm afraid of your power way, right? In a human way, so in a limited understanding way, it's a reminder of, like, my children and me. Or me and my dad. Like, there was a way where I was in awe of my dad, because my dad, you know, like, he always had all the answers, or at least I thought I did. He did until I turned 13. Right? So, and, but there was a way I also feared him. I remember there was one time I thought I was joking around with my mom, and I accidentally was stronger than I knew I was at that time, and I pushed her into a chair. We were kind of, like, I was messing around like I did with my dad. I wasn't thinking, right? And I did that, And then I heard my dad coming. And I ran into my bedroom, and I locked the door, and I went on the top bunk, and I hid between the mattress and the wall. And my dad was pounding on the door, and it was not one of those nice strong doors. It was a little flimsy. I could see like space between the door and the frame. And I'm like, I'm not letting you in. I know what's going to happen. So my dad got his tools and took the door off its hinges. Yeah. And he got in. And I'm hiding there. He's like, come down now. I'm like, I'm not coming down. So he just took the bed and pulled it away from the wall. Right? There is a fear there. Because I knew my dad was bigger than me and stronger than me. I'm like, I'm not getting a spanking. I'm not, right? Like, I'm not, no. There's a fear that's a rightful fear of God. He is just. He is holy. He is loving. He is caring. He's forgiving, right? Like, and I think that's, in today's world, everyone wants to focus on that aspect of God. He's forgiving. He's caring. Right? He's just the God of love. As if he's this, like, fluffy teddy bear God, right? God is just. God is powerful. God is a righteous wrath on sin. That is a view of God too. Really, those wristbands, right? What would Jesus do? Like, he might flip over tables and whip you. He did that before. Most people use that, what would Jesus do, as a, he would just love people, he'd walk with people. Yeah, he would do that. He'd also flip over tables and whip you if you did, right, like something obviously Pharisaically wrong. He is powerful and just. We can't separate the two. So when he says, behold the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, it is that fear of awestruckness before God, who should destroy you but loves you enough not to, who restrains his power even though we just see an outskirt of it, but also who has enough power to do what he did to Job and more. This is the fear of the Lord. This is the beginning of Job's discourse and how he responds to his friends who told him all sorts of bad advice, all sorts of things that he shouldn't listen to, or Bildad at the very end who says something, he's like, God is awesome and great and powerful and majestic, and he's like, how's that going to help me? That doesn't help me either. You're not answering my question. You're not walking with me in my struggles. So this is the beginning of Job's response. We're going to see more of that in verses 29 and 30 and 31 next time. So our goal next time is to get through the end of Job's response before we have somebody else interject their thoughts. So as you heard Job respond to his friends today of suffering and integrity and the power and majesty and the greatness of God and wisdom and the things of this world and the things of God, any questions or thoughts or anything as you were hearing that came to mind? You're like,
Just need to trust him.
yeah.
I like that part of Job better. The few chapters we've been going through.
Yeah, this part is. Yeah. But we're going to see that God's response too, right? And if you know God's response, you know how God's going to come in and kind of put Job in his place. Right? But yeah, this is a little bit better perspective that Job gives. For me, one of the greatest perspectives there is God does have his hand in everything. God is a part of everything. God is not separated from it. September 11th, when the planes hit the Twin Towers, it's not because God was not there. And they still remember that there were Christian preachers who even showed up and said, the reason they had the Twin Towers is because God has rejected America and left them. No, he has not. He's not rejected anybody. He's not rejected any country. He's not rejected any group of people. He's not rejected anything in that respect. Right? He is ever present in all things, and yet he is not the enemy. He is not the one that causes evil, but he does work it all for the good. Romans 8:28. That's good. Anything else? Any other thoughts? No? And then let's close with prayer. Holy Father, we thank you for the greatness of your wisdom, your power, and your majesty. Lord, in the midst of situations in our life where there is pain and brokenness, uncertainty and suffering, may we rest in the one in whom wisdom is found. May we rest in the source of wisdom. May we rest in knowing that we will not have all wisdom and all understanding. But if we are next to the one who does, then we're in the safest place possible. So Lord, may we find ourselves in your presence, by your side, always. May we be Mary who sits at the feet of Jesus, listening to him. May we be your servants who crave even a morsel from your table, knowing that even in that morsel of your greatness, your power, your wisdom, we have all that we need for this life. Lord, thank you for the food and for the lunch and the fellowship that we're about to have, as we thank you for how you provide our daily bread. We pray this in Jesus' name.